T minus 1 minute. It's 7 o'clock. Time to start the webinar. All together now, a fun group of people who care about humpbacks. Thank you everybody for joining us. I'm Jackie Hildering. A really big welcome to you all for taking the time to be with us. And we've seen in the registration list that that's everything from some of our wonderful directors, fellow researchers, students quite clearly, biology students, as well as data contributors and donators. So thank you all so much for being part of this. We'll do a quick technical check with Marika. Christy and I will give some background on the collaborations and what it is to be a research associate, and then we will get into it, the presentations, with the wonderful lineup of faces you see there, with 10 minutes each for presentation and up to 5 minutes for questions. And then again, an opportunity if there's time left at the end for questions as well as the end of all the presentations. So here's Marika, who's the technical brain behind this.
Hi, folks. I'm just going to be in there monitoring the chat. So if you have questions that come up during a presentation and you throw them into the chat, I will read them out. And as well, if you have any technical difficulties, I can try and talk you through that. So feel free to pop it into the chat and I will try and help you through.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Marika. So Christy, our research director, is going to talk about the importance of collaborations and what it is to be a MERS research associate.
All right. Yeah. Hi, everybody. So yeah, I'm Christy McMillan. I am the MERS research director and one of the co-founders as well. And yeah, super lucky to be working with this amazing group of research associates. And so each of the speakers that you'll hear from tonight, other than with the exception of Emily, are not actually MERS staff, but they are research associates who are actively conducting projects that help advance MERS's mission, which is to promote conservation and understanding of marine ecosystems. So with these speakers and our research associate here tonight include members of other organizations, also master's students at University of Victoria and University of British Columbia. And these partnerships with these associates are really meant to be beneficial all around. So it's a way for MERS to support and advise and promote these really important projects, but it also allows MERS to expand our reach a little bit in terms of our science and conservation and education efforts. And I think Jackie will talk now about one of these primary collaborations that a lot of these research associates are part of.
Indeed, and maybe it's a good idea that I introduce myself as well. I'm Jackie Hildering. I am located, and so is Marika, up on our base on Northern Vancouver Island in the territory of the Clayoquot speaking people. And I am a co-founder, humpback researcher, as is Christy, and also apparently in charge of communications and education. So let's see how that works. But one of the important collaborations indeed is who is it that is cataloging the humpbacks of British Columbia, and which is the background of all these presentations, needing to know who the whales are to gain better understanding and reduce threats. So it was Fisheries and Oceans Canada, DFO, that cataloged humpbacks up to 2010 for a province-wide catalog. And almost everybody who is now shown on this map was relaying their IDs to Fisheries and Oceans Canada. That stopped in 2010, and then we continued. We have now come together in a collaboration where we are following through with having a catalog for the full breadth of British Columbia's waters, with it being as important it is to, again, understand the whales. So those collaborators that are also giving presentations tonight, Gary is part of OceanWise, Tasli, a force behind Humpbacks of the Salish Sea, and Ashley and Mark are collaborators for Whales of Clayoquot and Barkley. So that is a bit of the background then for how we have all come together. And I will stop sharing my screen, and Tasli of Humpbacks of the Salish Sea will be the first to go.
All right. If everybody can hear me okay and see my presentation up on the screen. Well, thank you so much for tuning in this evening, and of course to the Marine Education and Research Society for hosting this really cool event. I'm very happy to be part of the MERS team as a research associate with my project, Humpback Whales of the Salish Sea. But before I go much further, I just want to define what the Salish Sea is exactly. So at the time we started this project, the term Salish Sea wasn't really in regular usage. And to date, I'm not really aware of any official definition of the region. This area in hot pink on the map kind of shows the generally agreed upon borders of the marine portions of the Salish Sea. And this lime green area is our study area, and I don't know what possessed me to pick these crazy colors, and I promise that the rest of the presentation won't be so garish. This is a relatively large area. It's about 16,000 square kilometers of ocean surface, and you may notice that the upper part of the Strait of Georgia is not included in our study area, and generally speaking, the good folks at MERS take care of the upper Strait of Georgia in terms of data processing, but there is actually a significant overlap with the whales seen in this region and the Central Salish Sea. The impetus for this project is the return of humpback whales to this region after exploitation by commercial whaling, and dedicated commercial whaling took place in coastal BC from around 1905 to 1967, and whaling catch data compiled by a DFO indicates that at least 5,600 humpback whales were taken between the 5 main whaling stations on the BC coast. So with those kinds of numbers and context in mind, it's easy to see why humpback whales were essentially absent from this region for most of the 20th century, and really the only reminders that we had of their presence were reflected in names like Blubber Bay on Texada Island and Whaling Station Bay on Hornby Island and so on. But in 1965, the International Whaling Commission banned whaling of humpback whales, and thus a new chapter was about to begin. And just really after a few decades of being untouched by whaling, the species began to show signs of rekindling their former glory. And it was really in the mid-90s that the humpbacks started to become a more regular occurrence in the Salish Sea. My colleague Mark Mallison has been documenting these whales since that time, which really laid the foundation for this project. And as the story goes, in 1997, one of these early pioneering humpback whales was photographed by Mark off of Victoria. And we now know this whale is Big Mama, and we've seen her almost every year since then. Her return each spring is a celebratory occasion by the local whale watching community. She's really one of the first whales to be sighted on an annual basis in the area, and she's brought 6 confirmed calves with her to the region, and she's now a grandmother, possibly a great-grandmother, but we'll get to that later. So at the time we first documented Big Mama, she was given an ID number by a DFO, which was BCY 0324. Up until 2010, DFO maintained a province-wide catalogue of all humpbacks seen in BC waters, which Jackie just described. So initially we were seeing whales that were already known to coastal BC, such as Big Mama, but then these new whales started to appear that weren't in the DFO catalogue, which is something that other humpback researchers coast-wide were also experiencing. So this influx of previously undocumented whales prompted us to start cataloging them and taking note of their behavior and who was having calves, etc. It also prompted my early correspondence with MERS because we were starting to notice that not only these whales weren't in the DFO catalog, they also weren't in the MERS catalog either. So we started counting them, and this figure shows how many individuals, unique individuals, we've documented each year between 2003 and 2021. And you might notice there's a pretty significant jump between 2015 and 2016, and this generally represents the year where most consistent effort on our part began, specifically in the western reaches of Juan de Fuca Strait, where it can be quite easy to observe large aggregations of this species. But this spike also follows a general trend of increased humpback whale reports from other groups documenting humpback whale sightings. We also track site fidelity, and one of the ways to readily observe this phenomena is via the calves, of course. And we had a pretty good sightings rate for returning 2021 calves this year, with 3/4 of them being seen again this year. So in their second year, kind of our average for documenting calves in their second year is around 50%. So 2022 was really great. And again, better effort likely accounts for this. But in addition to tracking overall numbers, we've also developed a registry that records individuals' life histories, sightings history, points of identification, there's biopsy or tagging history, evidence of entanglement, ship strike, and so on. We have, well, as of around 4 p.m. today, we have just over 1,100 confirmed individuals in the registry. So recording this level of detail allows us to track things such as these blossoming family dynasties in the region, such as Big Mama's family lineage. And her lineage helps us describe and kind of highlight some important aspects of our work, starting with her probable eldest daughter, Divot. So the knowledge of Divot being related to Big Mama came as a result of tracking down old images from a German tourist. So really highlighting the value of citizen science to pull pieces of the puzzle together, and really utilizing the whale watching community to better understand these whales, because we can simply not be everywhere all at once to document them all the time. And you may notice that Divot herself is quite prolific, meaning that Big Mama is likely a great-grandmother, with the birth of Zephyr's offspring, making Big Mama the only great-grandmother to regularly inhabit sort of the central Salish Sea area. Of course, this again demonstrates their site fidelity, as the calves learn from their mothers that this is a great place to feed for the summer, and generally, this results in subsequent generations returning to the region. And then we have Deer Canuck, whose story really highlights the threats these whales face as they recolonize their former range. Canuck was entangled in a type of fishing gear in summer of 2011, and the only indication that Canuck was entangled was a buoy attached to a line that was wrapped around Canuck's body. And at some point, this buoy was no longer attached to the line and may have been removed by a well-intentioned citizen thinking that they were helping Canuck out. But this simply removed the visible evidence of the entanglement and not the entanglement itself. So I know MERS has done really great work to highlight the perils of whale entanglements on the coast and how best to leave these rescue operations to the professionals and to the professionals only. I know Gary and Emily are going to be talking more about entanglement scarring later on, but unfortunately Canuck was never successfully disentangled and has not been seen since, but I still hold out some hope. Okay, Windsock, who's the probable grandchild of Big Mama, teaches us the value of not only collecting the traditional fluke photo, but also dorsal images of the whales, which is a practice also utilized by MERS, as do Mark and Ashley, who we're going to hear from in a moment. But as is common with calves, we did not get a good fluke photo for Windsock as a youngster, so having the dorsal allowed us to match this whale 6 years after we first documented them as a calf. So it was a really excellent recapture for us, as it answered the question of whether or not this calf survived, and it also demonstrated the usefulness of keeping records of their dorsals. So the humpbacks are back. Big Mama is cementing her dynasty in this area, but what does this all mean for their conservation in the region? And one of the looming threats is the increase in large commercial shipping traffic through the region. In this so-called hotspot map on the right, you can get a sense of where these humpback whale encounters tend to take place, and just keeping in mind that this is raw data, it hasn't been corrected for effort, but there does appear to be consistent humpback whale activity overlapping with major shipping routes, particularly those that go through Juan de Fuca Strait. And there is also overlap with the main BC ferry routes and hotspots in the Strait of Georgia. Recently published research by Christy McMillan, who of course is with us here this evening with DFO, investigated the migratory destination of humpback whales in BC. And among the many really interesting insights that the work produced, one of them was 13 individual humpbacks were documented as being part of the Central American humpback whale population, and 7 of these whales have shown site fidelity to the waters of southwestern Vancouver Island and the Salish Sea, including these 4 that I have on screen. So it brings up questions on how to keep the whales safe here, especially since there's whales in this region from an endangered population. So I could go on and on. I've only had 10 minutes. I hope I kept to time, but I hope this gave you an idea of what our project is aiming to accomplish and how collaborating with others ultimately helps the whales. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tasli. And folks, if you have any questions, if you want to enter those into the chat, please. Marika, do we have any there? Okay, you get a chance with Tasli at the end too, folks. Please, as we go, fill in the questions. Marika is monitoring them. And that means we have the joy of moving on to our next presentation. So the screen, it will be shared now with the other members represented here from the Canadian Pacific Humpback Collaboration. And that's Ashley Hoyland and Mark Sawyer, friends, colleagues. And over to Mark and Ashley.
Yeah, I think, there we go. Okay.
Is this working?
Yeah, we're good. Okay, awesome. Good evening, and thank you very much for the first presentation there, Tasli. That was awesome to listen to. We're just going to briefly introduce ourselves together, and then you're going to see one of us on screen at one time because we have a toddler just to wrangle in the background. So I'm Ashley Hoyland. This is my partner Mark Sawyer, and we're both whales of Clayoquot and Barkley. So I guess I'll just start off with a little bit of an introduction to what our project has been over the last few years. We basically tried to photograph and document as many of our encounters with whales out here on the West Coast as we can, and sort of record as much associated data as we've been able to do. But what's been really great is that we've also been able to expand that network to include lots of other people and lots of other citizen scientists on the West Coast as well. So I would be lucky to work with colleagues in the whale watching industry, fishing guides, tourists, water taxi operators, First Nations collaborators, federal parks employees, people that work in offshore communities. So we've really managed to grow this amazing network of community effort to really make these data points count, we hope, for science. And that really has given us lots of extra information and being able to broaden the scope of what we do, as well as collect more data. So just for an example, for last year, in 2022, I know this is quite small on the screen, so I apologize. You can see there that we managed to collect 94 unique tales last year as part of this group, this citizen scientist network. It was more than that. I think it was well over 100 if you included the dorsal only IDs that we got as well. So of those 94, 56 hadn't received a BC code yet. So without getting into the nitty gritty of that, there was a couple of those that had been seen on Swiftsure by American research colleagues. But safe to say 56, the vast majority of those we think hadn't been seen in BC before. And then 38 of those whales as well, as far as we could tell, were new to science. So they hadn't been recorded in either a breeding area or a feeding area. So pretty good going for the community effort on the west coast of Vancouver Island there. We're pretty proud to be part of that effort. There's one more important thing that I kind of wanted to underline, as well as the, aside from the science benefit of having this network, go through us to the CPHC, informing understanding of humpbacks locally and regionally. So aside from that science benefit, there's also, this local network then of informed and engaged local mariners. So you've got people that are informed about this research and conservation priority, who are more likely to educate other people, more likely to engage in good boater behaviour around these marine mammals. They're more likely to be ambassadors for that good boater behaviour. They're also more likely to use the marine mammal hotline when it's appropriate. So, this kind of like this community of water users that are knit together in this important way, sort of united in this common purpose of just, what's good for the whales, is in no small part something that really motivates me to continue to try and grow the citizen science network as well. I'm gonna move on to a few examples of things that we've managed to learn on the West Coast out here as a direct result of having this wide network of citizen science contributors. So data that we've been able to capture that we wouldn't necessarily have known without all this wide contribution from all these different people. So I'm going to let Mark do that. So I'll just swap over here.
Sorry, just juggling a child. We wanted to just go through, like Ashley said, a handful of examples of hopefully examples that kind of drive home the importance of that network. This was a whale that was reported entangled in 2021 in Barkley Sound. It was the calf of a really well-known whale down here called Pinky. I believe Jim Darlin and Pacific Wildlife Foundation have a real long history kind of documenting this whale here for over 20 years now. And one of the things with entanglement, as well as having a network of people that know what to look for and hopefully report the whales that they find entangled and manage to, understand, not overstepping the boundaries there, but make sure that these incidents are reported. It's really hard to know survival rates for some of these animals, and we're kind of trying to drive home here the importance of any photograph. And we were trying to piece together a whale that we'd seen in 2022 in kind of September last year. And we reached out to a guide in Ucluelet that we knew maybe had some photographs of Pinky's calf, and the two images kind of to the right. So this is the photograph after the calf was disentangled. You can see there's a small kind of cut in the tail, a little ridge still left there around the peduncle. But these were the photographs he said of the scent of the whale's calf, which on their own at the time were tricky, and we kind of thought, great, probably not going to use them too much down the line. But there's a couple of little marks on here, particularly this mark on the fluke. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the bottom fluke here, there's kind of a vertical line on there that we managed to match to this calf tail, or this young humpback's tail, the year after, proving that this calf, as Tasli had said in the previous talk, as well as a calf that's returned to this area. We've also had boaters report incidents like this. Vessel strikes a very real threat, and understanding who the whales are and the site fidelity, the areas that these whales use, can lead to attempts to mitigate the threats to these whales. This is a whale called Props, probably you can see with good reason. And we were able to document that scarring and how it's changed over time. This was very, very recent at this point. We believe less than a month since that incident happened, and the scarring is now black, but it still has the large scar across the whale. There's some good news stories. This is a whale, it's Eugenia, BCX 1493, who we've photographed with a calf now in 2020 and 2022. But again, kind of the importance of any particular photograph having importance. This is her with a 2020 calf. This is the 2022 calf, and not a whale that was lifting its tail particularly frequently. Again, like Tasli said, using the dorsals to hopefully try and recite these whales in subsequent years. But we did get one photograph submitted by John Ford of mum and calf fluking at the same time. And we noticed this slice in the tail here. And maybe I don't know if you can see my mouse, but hopefully you can. Looks like some killer whale rake marks on there as well. But it matched up, we think, pretty well to a photograph submitted at another point in the season that helped us kind of piece together that these whales were maybe around for a little bit longer, and hopefully should give us a better shot at reciting that calf and piecing this all together down the line. I wanted to mention flick feeding really quickly here, looking at the time. Flick feeding is something that we're starting to see, particularly in the spring off the coast of Clayoquot and Barkley. And I say starting to see, it's been going on for a while. We're just starting to kind of try and focus a little more on particular individuals. And again, the importance of any particular photograph. For those who've not seen flick feeding, the whales upside down in the water here and swishing the tail around at the surface, kind of like if you were splashing a friend in a swimming pool. It's a technique used to feed on krill, and then they'll lunge at the surface. And we've been documenting the photograph on the left here is a photograph I took in 2019. In 2022, my dad was out on a trip with someone else and ended up seeing the same humpback whale 3 years later using the same technique to feed in a completely different location. But it's a technique that we're starting to see with a little bit more consistency, and something that we're really trying to zero in on which whales are using it, and if there is a kind of a cultural spread of this technique being passed on. Tasli mentioned dorsals. I wanted to mention this whale really quickly and the importance. I honestly have no clue if this is entanglement, if this is from birth. There was a humpback whale in Australia, I believe, with a similar shaped dorsal from birth. But you never know what you're going to see in the importance. This whale was around for 1 day last season that we saw out here. There's no documentation of this whale anywhere that we can find. And it's kind of exciting to see, okay, well, where's this whale going to pop up next, and what's going to happen? I'm just trying to stress that importance of any photograph that you sat on, no matter how old it is, that there could be an incredibly powerful story or an incredibly powerful benefit to that being shared. So I just trying to urge people to send those photographs in.
Thank you so much, Mark and Ashley. And where to send it into, if you send it in through bchumpbacks.com, wherever you click on the map, it'll go to the collaborator who is processing the data for that area. Do we have questions, folks? Again, there's an opportunity at the end for any questions. We'll move on. So now we have the joy of Ali Gladwell to talk about boat disturbance, understanding the guidelines, and where our education efforts should go.
Sorry, I'm just, it's for some reason showing my end slide to show instead of my beginning one.
All good. Got through 2 presentations with minimal technical issues. Do. So again, folks, our appreciation, I'll fill the time here with you choosing to know more about humpbacks and this incredible good luck in having a second chance with them. You are helping us collectively as well in delivering puzzle pieces through data contribution and through sharing knowledge generally. I'll be quiet now, and it's Ali.
All right. Hi, everyone. I am so pleased to be here tonight. My name's Ali, and I'm zooming in from Victoria on the Wasanich and Lekwungen speaking people's territory, unceded territory. And I am going to be chatting with you about if we are getting too close for comfort, and my work looking at boater behavior around humpbacks in the Johnstone Strait area and research to help inform boater education. And just saying hi with the humpback nicknamed Domino breaching around the Johnstone Strait region. in Northeast Vancouver Island. So I just wanted to introduce myself a little more and share who this work is being done for and by. I have a background in marine biology, and this project is actually my master's thesis right now. However, I've also spent a lot of time in outdoor education and science communication spaces, which I'm really, really passionate about. And this ties in a lot with how I work with MERS and how we work together and the aims of the project. So most of all, this work is being done for the whales, like Argonaut here making a splash, and for you, or for anyone who spends time on the water with humpbacks and killer whales. So yes, this is largely for whale conservation, but also for boater safety and to know how to coexist with these amazing animals safely out on the water. And this project is primarily partnered with MERS, as we all are tonight, and their education campaign, which I'll expand on in a moment, along with my work at UVic and the Applied Conservation Science Lab there. So why is this work important? Why is looking at boater behavior important? As I'll expand on shortly, my work is aiming to provide a framework to understand our interactions with marine mammals better. Now, I'm also looking at other species than humpbacks, but I'll be focusing on them tonight, as that's why we're all here this evening. And our main objective is to help inform and provide direction to the awesome See a Blow, Go Slow education campaign put on by MERS. Education and community awareness like this, as Mark and Ashley just said, is so critical to conservation and safety out on the water. And as amazing as this campaign already is, this work can help provide direction and education priorities to make this effort even more effective. And another goal of this work is to inform any future management decisions regarding the regulations and guidelines that I'll expand on in a second. So as has already been said a little bit, to add a little background, every year, vessel traffic has been increasing. So to give you a picture of this, maritime traffic globally has increased fourfold over the last 20 years, and it keeps on increasing. And that can definitely be seen here around Vancouver Island. And we are also very fortunate to have seen the return of the humpbacks to the area, woohoo, and the humpback comeback. However, they have very different behavior than the orcas that we're used to navigating around in the waters with. So with the increased humpback and vessel traffic, this has led to a greater risk of vessel strikes, which has become more and more of a threat to humpbacks, but also to boater safety. So to bring it a little closer to home, if you think about driving your car down the highway, we know how to look out for deer or elk. We know those animals are there and we know how to look out for them. And now that I'm comparing humpbacks to deer, there's a lot more deer. Yeah, we know that it's really dangerous to get in a crash with these animals, and we need this kind of awareness and vigilance with the whales. They are a lot bigger and a lot more hidden and conspicuous than a deer is crossing the road. So to try and help this threat of vessel collisions to both the whales and boaters, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, or DFO, has placed what's called marine mammal regulations and guidelines. And although the intentions are really great, these are pretty confusing. They change based on species, where you are in the island, if that animal has a calf, for example. And they're actually also pretty confusing for people who are researching them. These interactions are pretty poorly understood, and how boaters interact with humpbacks it's a tricky thing to understand, as that we don't have a good grasp on what's happening out on the water in a way that's systematic to see kind of patterns and trends emerge. So this leads into my first research question, is to ask how are people interacting with whales in the Northeast Vancouver Island. So yes, we are looking at those regulations, and which is mainly around distance of the boat to the whale, to have an idea how those regulations are being used and known out on the water. But we're also looking at other indicators of interaction, such as the number of boats near a whale and how much time is spent with a whale as well. And I'm hoping to find a way to incorporate speed in there as well, but it's a little tricky on the methods side for that one. And digging a little deeper into that first question is, what are the traits of boaters and marine mammals that may explain the interactions between them? And by traits, I mean, for example, the general vessel types like cruise ship, commercial fishing, whale watching, or recreational boat. The species involved in the interaction. So as I've said, focusing on humpbacks, but also including killer whales, dolphins and porpoises and sea lions in there as well. The behavior at the time. So what is that animal doing? And if these interactions change depending on where we are in the region. So we're hoping to answer this Whale's question on the right side there, if try and get a little better of an algorithm and framework to so they can kind of predict our movements and we can hopefully find out more about theirs as well. And so we did have an opportunity to go out and test this project as a pilot season. So how did we actually go about doing this? There's a couple of different methods, but the main way to see these interactions is when there's a whale in sight, we follow it for as long as possible, then make observations of boats that are within a kilometer of the whale. Now we understand that every boat might not see the whale. So this is why we're taking down time spent within that distance of the whale. And this is when we also make note of the general vessel type, species, and we do try and identify the individual whale either with photos or out in the field with a scope, its behavior, and whether it's alone, in a group, or with a calf. So in summary, this summer we were out there for a month and we saw 129 unique boater and humpback interactions, again within 1 kilometer. But within that time, in 1 month, only 15 times was a humpback present on the water without a boat within 1 kilometer of it. So that's only 11% of like that whole month of observations. And the average distance, which I'll get into in a second, of boaters to humpbacks was 450 meters, which is really great. And I'll quickly go over the basic results of what we saw. Again, this is only preliminary data. So on the bottom axis here, we have a distance of a boat to a humpback within 1 kilometer. And on the vertical axis is just the count of how many observations we saw, otherwise the frequency. And so this summer, this is kind of the spread of the distances, and only 6 observations out of 129 were under 100 meters, which is the local regulation to be near a humpback, which is really awesome to see. However, 100 meters, again, is the minimum distance that a boat should be getting near a humpback if they see it. And so we want to investigate what's going on with the boats that are a little bit farther away and find out why and try and see some patterns in there as well. And another metric is the number of vessels within 1 kilometer of a humpback, sorry. And again, on the vertical axis is just the frequency of those observations seen with the number of boats. And this is what we saw. So again, really interesting to see is that most often there are 1, 2, or 3 boats near humpbacks. Now, from our preliminary data, we may be seeing a pattern that although there are fewer boats, they're getting closer to humpbacks, and there's a different response to killer whales. That there are more boats, but they're farther away. And this is a trend that's just popping up. This is something I'm hoping we find out more this summer with more data to kind of tease that pattern out and ask more questions about it. Which leads us into the next step for this project, to plan and have an awesome full field season in 2023, and hoping to have a complete study and results by the summer of 2024. And I'll leave you again with this photo of domino breaching. Thank you so much. And I'd love to answer any questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, Ali. Really, really great to hear the progress and the methodology. And indeed, we're not doing this so that the humpbacks know what the humans are doing. We're doing it for the humans to take into consideration what the species are doing. Any questions at all, folks? I think there's a choice for almost everybody to be asking the questions at the end. Which is great. And there are questions being answered live as well, folks. Again, in Q&A or in chat, fire away with your questions. And we will now hear from the next project. We have the joy
Quick
of
question
hearing from
for
Joanne.
Ali, though, before we move on, Jackie.
Thank you, Marika.
So Tammy asked, were most of the interactions that you observed with commercial ships or recreational boaters?
So yeah, we saw just sheer numbers. We saw a lot more recreational boats, but that makes sense. There's just more people driving recreational boats than there are commercial. But yeah, that's something I hope we see more, or we just have more time to see this summer. It was a little bit difficult as like with commercial boats, the sites we choose, they were a little bit farther away for our methods, which was a little trickier. So hopefully that will kind of tease out in this full field season this summer. But yeah, this the sheer number of vessels we saw, the kind of biggest demographic was recreational boaters. Yeah.
Yeah, and before we keep going, oh, Jackie's going to handle this one.
Yeah, we have a question from one of our directors. Thank you, Jake. It's about drone and whale interactions in the work, and I can't stop myself as the educator. So flying drones over marine mammals is illegal. And Ali, I don't know if you have seen anything other than what is happening under either a filming license or a research license.
Nope. Didn't the only ones we saw were under a research license of researchers doing photogrammetry work. That was the only ones I saw, which was great.
And then we have a question too from Karen. And this, Ali, you may want to lob back at me, let me know. The question is, have there been any known instances of humpbacks actively attacking or interfering with pleasure boats in the Salish Sea? Actually, this is going back to Tasli. I think we're going to save this question for the end, and there might be multiple people with input, but what is being referenced there is what gets called, we don't call it mugging, but what colloquially gets called mugging behavior, where humpbacks are directed at boats. We will come back to that question at the end. Marika, are there any other questions for Ali specifically?
Yeah, someone else is also going to be looking at whale behavior near vessels. I don't know who it is because you're in under anonymous. They asked specifically about ideas on assessing breathing rates of humpbacks. Do you have any input there, Ali?
Interesting. Yeah, so the way we take our observations is just taking basically we take observations every 2 minutes when a humpback is in view, but that could be more often. That's just more like our ability to take in all the information and take notes down. It takes about 2 minutes. But if you were taking breathing rate, I think if the humpback is regularly surfacing, I think you could just do breaths per minute like we do our breathing rate. But that may be difficult as they go down for deep dives. So it might get messed up a little bit with that breathing rate. I don't know if anyone else has any ideas, but that's really what I would think of, is kind of take it similar to ours and just do breaths per minute.
Christy,
Yeah.
do you want to input at all on this one?
Sure, yeah. Hi, whoever asked that question. I actually did, as part of my master's research on the humpback whales off northeastern Vancouver Island, and I was looking at the energetic needs of humpback whales and the role of herring in meeting those needs of humpback whales just up in that northern Vancouver Island area specifically. And so I did do some looking at breathing rates, and we did it by doing focal follows. So it was the idea of knowing the super importance of knowing a humpback whale as soon as possible when it comes up by its dorsal fin and from a distance. But we were able to do hour-long focal follows where we stayed at a distance from the whales, but knowing these individuals as well as we did, we can actually identify them by their dorsal fins, their flukes, in some cases their mouths. So it allowed us to be able to get that breathing rate. I think the really key part of that, though, is being able to quickly recognize the whale as an individual, or be lucky enough to just have one whale in the area. But whoever asked that question, if you want to reach out after, I'm happy to discuss that further as well.
Thank you so much. And I see that there's 3 open questions. We're going to leave those for the end. There's some more general thematic questions about boat whale knowledge of the presence of boats, humpback knowledge specifically. So we will be leaving those questions open. Marika's keeping track of them. We'll answer them at the end. Thank you so much, Ali, yet again. And now we have the joy of learning from Joanne.
Sorry, I lost my my Zoom for a second and couldn't unmute. Can you see my slides all right? Yeah, perfect. Amazing. So hi, everyone. My name is Joanne. I am a master's student at the University of British Columbia. I am super proud to be a MERS research associate, and I am also an aquatic science technician at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And with those 3 organizations collaborating together, I have undertook a master's, which I will talk to you about today, and it looks at what humpback whales eat in the Northern Strait of Georgia. There we go. So by now, I assume you know a lot about humpback whales, so I'm just going to state some key facts that are important to this study. But we know that humpback whales are large baleen cetaceans and that they undergo a huge migration to the tropical waters where they breed and have babies. And they come back to BC and the North Pacific feeding areas, where they come and feed. And to sustain that long migration during which they fast, they have to eat a decent amount of food, if not to say a huge amount of food, to be able to do so. So it was estimated that about 5 to 30% of their body weight they eat annually. So that's a lot. And some of their main prey items that we presume around Vancouver Island are krill and Pacific herring. But what I am interested in is to really determine the diet composition of humpback whales in the northern part of the Strait of Georgia. And so that is, again, the research question, looking at what they eat. But why is this important? So not only this research will satisfy our scientific curiosity as to what these giants of the sea eat, but it also is relevant for their conservation. In fact, it will allow us to provide guidance on how much food is needed to sustain the population of humpback whales that we are so lucky to have around Vancouver Island. And there are different methods to do diet analysis. One is through observational study. The other one is the analysis of whale poop, which is very interesting to collect. And we also have whale biopsies and analysis of stomach content from stranded whales. And we can go in through the pros and cons of each methodology. But for now, I just want you to know that for my project, I was using whale biopsies. And so these whale biopsies were collected by the Marine Mammal Conservation Physiology Program of Fisheries and Ocean Canada. And they made available to us 64 unique humpback whales biopsies that were taken under their research license. And with that, I am performing stable isotope analysis. But what is stable isotope analysis, you may ask? It is a complicated concept, but first I'm going to take you back to your high school chemical classes. Don't worry, I'm not going to go dig in too deep about this, but all you have to know is that all of these elements form every single matter that is on this earth, from your kitchen countertop to the air you breathe, or even to the tissues that form our bodies, but also those of the whales. And for this project, we're mainly looking at carbon and nitrogen. Why? Because carbon is an indicator of where things are found in the ocean, so whether they are on the bottom of the seafloor or in the water column, and how close they are to shore or more offshore. And nitrogen is an indicator of trophic level, so where things are found in the food web, at what level do they feed. But not all elements are created equals. So while carbon has always the same number of protons and electrons, it will vary in the number of neutrons. For example, carbon 13 has 13 neutrons compared to carbon 12, which makes it heavier. But again, we're not going to dig too deep into the chemical analysis. All I need you to remember is that different ratios between the heavy and the light isotope produce different signatures. And when I say different signatures, is that different species will have different ratios of those isotopes in their body. So what do we expect? Since each species, pre-species have their signature, as shown here in different colors. So let's say herring has a blue and then krill is pink. If that signature is reflected into the body of the humpback whale, then we can infer something about their diet. And this is really a case of you are what you eat. And note that the following, there we go. I know that these are really hypothetical values, but basically with some fancy statistical analysis and the stable isotope values, we can estimate the proportion of each prey species into the humpback whale diet. Just as an example, we could say, oh, herring is 40% and krill is 55% and stuff like that. And here's what an example of what stable isotope ratios look like. So again, on the x-axis, we have the delta in carbon, so really that difference, different ratio. And then on the y-axis, we have the nitrogen, which indicates the trophic level. And we would expect something like that, having our euphausid or our krill at the bottom, then in the middle our schooling fish, and at the top our apex predator. In this case, I've put an example of an orca, but you can really think of different apex predators that we see. But the question remains, where does humpback whale fit in this graph? Well, the next slide is going to present very, very preliminary results, but still very interesting. So here is what we found so far. And all I want you to note from this graph is that really what we appear to see is that the humpback whale seems to be at the same trophic level than the herring in blue and the anchovy in gray, which can bring us to think that they feed mainly on a lower trophic level, so more krill. So that's super exciting to see, but I want you to remember that this only represents 46 of the 64 humpback whale samples, and it only looks at the northern part of the Strait of Georgia during the summer months, so July, August, and September. Some future steps in this research, as I told you previously, I'm going to use those fancy statistics to try and see the contribution of each of the different prey items into the diet of the whales. So really looking at the amount of krill that they eat relative to the amount of herring or other prey. I also would like to investigate composition changes between key foraging areas and seasons. So maybe look at the Juan de Fuca Strait and the Quick Charlotte Strait. And also we know that the whales are staying a little longer in the year, so maybe look at that as well. And then the final part of my master's would be using an ecosystem modeling to predict the food web effect of a recovering humpback whale population. So that modeling part will really allow us to see how much food is not only needed for humpback whales right now, but also in the future, as other people have presented that humpback whales are currently recovering from whaling. And so this really brings us back to our goal of reducing threats to humpback whales, as to know how much food they will need today and how much food they will need in the future. But it also integrates into a bigger goal, which is looking at the ecological role of the humpback whale around Vancouver Island. And I think that really all the MERS research associated tonight contribute to that big overarching goal of knowing the whales around here and what they do and how they benefit us so much as well. And so with that, I'd like to thank the funders and the collaborators with whom, without whom the project could not be possible. And I will take any questions you may have on the chemistry or anything else.
all the chemistry questions, Joanne. What a
All of
daring
them.
thing to say. So we'll
Two-
wait for a few minutes to see if there's any questions at all. And then for the
Yes.
more general questions, we will answer them at the end, folks, after the last presentation and the presentation specific questions have been answered. Marika?
Yeah, there's a question that specifically, I'm not sure, Joanne, if you've had data on this, but there was a question asked by Julia if there's an impact on feeding near fish farms and whether you're seeing that come up in your sampling.
So in the research that we do not necessarily sample near fish farm personally. So I wouldn't be able to say anything about that, unfortunately, but I think it would be a really cool thing to look at as well.
Okay, I see that there's a comment as well, and Marika will look through that one and see if we address that at the end.
I
So
think we
now,
do we have time for one more related
we
question
do.
for Joanne? Joanne, there's a question about krill population and strength in the area from Craig.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm currently working on the model development part with my supervisor, Billy Christensen, who knows a lot more about krill than I do. So we'll definitely be looking into population dynamics of the different prey species, so the krill, and see how right now things might affect it, because we know that these little creatures are so important at the basis of the food web and can be impacted so much by climate change and other things like that. So that's definitely something that I will be looking into. But yeah, for now, I don't have the full answer to that question yet.
Okay, one more question for you, and then we have to keep going. But Steve wanted to know how fast the turnover of N and C isotopes are, so how current the analysis is.
Perfect. Yeah. So from the literature, it is hard to know the turnover rate, but the turnover rate of carbon to nitrogen is believed to be anywhere from a month to maybe 3 months. So that's something that we are looking at. That's why I wanted to highlight that the period that we're looking at is really July, August, September, to get the best to catch that variability in turnover rate during those summer months. There is also some colleagues at DFO who will be looking at intra-seasonal variability. So really, if there is a differences between those months from individual to individual, and they will be able to hopefully tell us more about turnover rate in humpback whale skin.
thank you so very much, Joanne. And yes, they're ready. We have Team Oceanwise and MERS, Emily and Gary with their presentation.
Sorry, I'm just going to work to
Oh, yeah.
share the slide here.
While Emily's bringing it up, I'll just kind of get us started. And thank you guys so much for having me present here tonight and for having us as a research associate at Oceanwise. My name's Gary. I'm a whale research technician with the Whales Initiative at Oceanwise. And I'll get more into about our recent photogrammetry this past season and our collaboration with MERS, specifically looking at humpback whale scarring using drones. But I'll hand it off to Emily to get us started here.
Before I start, just want to make sure that the slides look okay. Good to go? Okay, so my name is Emily Cowie. I am the research coordinator for the Marine Education Research Society. I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about why we're doing this study, some past research. I'll hand it back to Gary, who will talk about data collection, and then I will get into the data analysis. So why are we studying scars on humpback whales? So as you've heard from previous presentations tonight, humpback whales have made a return to the coast in the waters off the BC coast. So with this increase in humpback numbers, there is now an increased overlap of where the whales are, fishing areas, and vessel traffic. So this leaves the whales more vulnerable to entanglement in fishing gear or being struck by a vessel. In order to understand the scope of the threat, we can't look to dead whales, whales that have died as a result of these interactions, as it's often that dead whales sink or they wash up on are somewhere along our vast coast and can go unseen. So to understand these threats, we look at the scarring on whales that have survived these incidents. And these scars will tell us and help us understand how prevalent these threats are. So there have been studies done in the past that have looked at entanglement of humpback whales off the coast of BC. A study done by MERS and the DFO assessed entanglement rates by looking at tailstock photographs. So this is a photograph of humpback whale tailstock. This is Argonaut, and those arrows are pointing to characteristic entanglement scars. So there's the wrapping scar around the fluke and tailstock. And this is how this study was conducted. So preliminary results from this study showed that 47% of humpbacks in BC waters have survived at least one entanglement. So this study that we're working on now is using aerial photographs, and this will allow us to see more of the whale's body to look and assess for entanglement scarring, as well as assess for evidence of vessel strikes. The study will also provide us a means to compare these two methodologies for research going forward. So now I'll just pass it on to Gary, who's going to talk about data collection.
Thanks, Emily. So just to get started on our data collection, this is our chariot. This is our platform. It's our 28-foot research boat named Scanna. For the past 9 years, the boat's been dedicated to northern resident killer whale photogrammetry work, mostly based off northeastern Vancouver Island and a little bit on the central coast as well. And we've been opportunistically collecting humpback aerials when there's, the same matriline in the same area for days. We'll kind of move over to humpbacks and figured it was a really good opportunity to collaborate with MERS to this important project that they're working on and kind of gain more insight into the scarring on these animals. So typically we work as a team of 3. So we'll have the vessel operator, which is a role I usually fill. And on top of that, doing photo ID at the same time so that we can, first of all, know who we're flying over to make sure we're not flying over the same animal multiple times, but making sure we have that individual data, which is really important as well. And then we have the drone pilot, which is filled by Dr. Lance Barrett-Leonard, and the camera operator, which has been sort of a rotation, but this year it was filled by Amy Rowley and Sharon Kay. And then you can see Brittany Visona Kelly there catching our DJI Matrice drone, which is what we use to photograph these animals. Next slide, please. So the areas that we operated in particular for this year, our first official year of collaboration with MERS, was Bella Bella to start. So as far as humpbacks were concerned, we typically focused our efforts in the Fitzhugh Sound area. So for anybody who's operated up that way, it's pretty thick with humpbacks in the region. So we spent a lot of our time around there before moving up to Camano Sound and then back down through Bella Bella and eventually ending in MERS backyard there in Blackfish Sound. Next slide. So for our collection methods, Steve actually brought this up in the chat earlier, which is great, is that this collection method allows us to not have to get really close to the animals. We can still maintain 100 to 200 meter distance, launch the drone, and then when we're flying over the animals, we typically are keeping a 20 to 40 meter altitude. We try for 30, but it really depends on the animal's behavior. If they're being really erratic, we'll move up to 40 to give us a greater chance of actually getting something. And if they're being really cooperative, like sometimes you guys know how a nook shook can be when you just kind of logs there like a log for an hour, you can move down to 20 meters and get them completely in the frame. And then obviously flat, clear water is really imperative for getting really good data. So we're always looking for the best conditions for that. And then we'll try to position the drone directly over the whale, and ideally targeting animals that are resting or in a traveling pattern to be more predictable. Next slide. Which brings us to some of the challenges, which we collected this photo up in Camano Sound this year, which is quite a spectacle to see. But as far as photogrammetry goes and collecting aerial data, it's very difficult. These big dynamic feeding groups make it quite challenging. That's one of the big ones. Another one is, like I mentioned earlier, the differences between areas like Blackfish Sound and the Central Coast. Weather and water clarity is a huge one. So typically up on the Central Coast, you're usually fighting rain or swell or fog or wind. So there wasn't as many days as there was in Blackfish Sound that were ideal, but we're still able to get some good data. And of course, humpbacks, like we've discussed already, they're here for feeding. So there's, as you guys know from Blackfish Sound, there's constant direction changes and fairly erratic behavior as they're looking to chase down the next bait ball, which can be a lot more difficult than say with killer whales, who tend to be a lot more rhythmic in their movements. And the batteries on these drones typically last about 20 minutes. And I swear the whales knew that, because it seemed like, we'd be chasing around with drones trying to get over them. And then by the time we had to come back and change batteries, they'd all of a sudden start resting at the surface and be really cooperative until we launched again. And then they resumed that feeding behavior. Next slide. So this kind of gives you an idea. This was a picture of a whale, BCY 0748 or T, in Fitzhugh Sound. So you can see the water clarity isn't great. You can see some scarring on the back there, but if you look at the rest of the animal towards the head or the fluke, it's really difficult to make out or assess any scars. It really made us appreciate working in the Johnstone Strait Blackfish Sound area, where you're really treated to this beautiful clear water a lot of the time. If you go to the next slide, you can see a shot of BCY 0728 or conger in Johnstone Strait, which obviously is a lot nicer when we're trying to do these scarring analysis. So in Kamado, on the Central Coast in Kamado Sound, we did encounter about 18 animals, but we were only able to do about 4 dedicated flights over them. Whereas in Blackfish Sound, we saw 13 different individuals, but we're able to do 12 dedicated humpback flights. So definitely a more productive area for that. We also had our North Coast team, which you can see here. They are operating out of Prince Rupert, mostly focused on the Eastern Dixon entrance area and Chatham Sound. And that team was led by Karina Draycott, Ashley Bachart, and Amy Minot. And if you go to the next slide, this was their first year doing the drone work. So it was a pilot study for them. And they encountered a lot of the same issues that we did, specifically in Kamado Sound. If you go to the next slide, you can see they're typically dealing with these really large dynamic groups of cooperative feeding humpbacks, which is, again, a spectacle to see. But when you're trying to narrow in on a particular individual to follow, that's difficult in itself. And then on top of that, you have all these exhales coming up at the same time, which gives difficulties for the camera to focus on the right particular point. So those were some of the challenges that they had. But all in all, it was a great season, and we hope to keep it going. And we'll toss it back over to Emily.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about how we're analyzing these photographs and looking at the scars on the whales. So we have been working to develop a methodology to analyze these aerial photographs and look for those characteristic scarrings for entanglement and vessel strikes. So each whale is going to be analyzed independently by myself and Christy McMillan, who's on this call as well, to look for these scars. While we're analyzing these images, we don't know the ID of the whale. So as Gary mentioned previously, the ID of the whale is known when the images are being taken, but during this analysis, we don't know the ID of the whale. So I can't know this whale is Argonaut per se, and know that Argonaut's been entangled in the past. So these whales are ID'd as individual 1, 2, 3 while we're doing this analysis. For the photo analysis, we are looking at 6 different body regions of the whale, and we're analyzing each body region independently. So we're looking through the series of photos that were captured for each individual. And so we're not just working from one image for each whale. Once we've analyzed each body region and assigned a scar code for each body region, we'll be giving an overall scar code to the individual whale that will describe the likelihood of previous entanglement or previous vessel strike. So I've included these photos here just to show the differences between the types of scars that we're looking at. So the scars can vary in their injuries and scar types, and there is quite a difference between entanglement scarring and vessel strike scarring. So as you can see, Sage in the top left corner has typical scars that you'd see from previous entanglement. There's the wrapping scars around the tailstock region, but these scars vary when looking at Lorax, who has a more severe injury caused by entanglement and different resulting scars. entanglement doesn't just occur on the tailstock or fluke region of a humpback. As you can see, this whale BCC 036 has severe entanglement around the head and mouth region. The types of scarring for vessel strike can also vary and look different, but it's tends to be a bit more obvious. As you can see, Raza has really obvious vessel strike scarring, propeller scarring. So we know that Raza has been hit by a vessel in the past. Galaxy also has the same type of propeller scarring, but looks quite different. Trooper, on the other hand, has a different type of injury and different resulting scars. And these are just the types of scars that we're going to be looking for in these aerial photos. So how are we actually going to code these scars and describe what we're seeing on these whales? So we've developed a system to score the scars that we see in each body region of the whale. And so each body region will be assigned a score from 0 to 5, where 0 is no visible marks and 5 is extensive tissue damage. So describing really clear indication of entanglement. And so this methodology was built upon by previous studies done on humpback whale entanglement and modified for this study here. So like I said, we're working through a series of photos for each body region of the whale. So this whale, as you can see, has some scarring on its back. And Christy and I both looked at this whale and analyzed it independently and decided that this scar code would be a scar 3, so linear or wide scars, which appear to wrap around a portion of the body. We then look at all body regions of the whale and the entire series of photographs and come up with a overall score that describes the likelihood of past entanglement. From this series of photos, we determined that it was a 3, so it was likely that scars were from a past entanglement event. Scars from vessel strikes are a bit different. Like I described in the previous slide, they look a bit different and they're a bit more obvious of their origin. So we've come up with a description that describes the scarring and that describes scarring from a vessel strike. So this is the same whale, the same individual, and we noticed on the tailstock region that there was this scar here. It's kind of hard to see in this photograph, but that's kind of what we're working with. All the photographs aren't the same as Gary described. So this scar here, we determined that it was an SV, so it's likely from a vessel. Again, working through the series of photos, we determined that this whale, again, had a score of 3, so likely that the scars were from a past vessel strike. So that's just a little bit about how we are going to be analyzing these photos. And that's sort of what's next in this project. We've got lots of photos to analyze, and we're going to be working through those before Gary and the crew with OceanWise comes back with us with a whole bunch of new photos from the 2023 season. And of course, what's next in the story, this study, is to just make the study count. So we want to learn about the threats and reduce the threats to humpback whales. So yeah, thank you. And if you have any questions, please throw them our way.
Thank you so much, Emily and Gary. And that brings the presentations to a close. There are questions for Emily and for Gary. And then we'll move to the more general questions where thankfully we'll also have some of Christy's insights for the answers. So for Gary, there was a question specifically from Steve. Gary, I wonder if the ability to adjust a polarizing filter on the drone to cut water reflection would help with seeing through the surface.
Yeah, it's something to think about. Usually the glare isn't as much of an issue as the water clarity itself. So I'm not sure the polarizer would help much with that, obviously, but there are certain times when it would be nice to have a polarizer, but it certainly hasn't been one of our big hindrances anyway.
Thank you. And Marika, I think there's more questions for
There
Gary and Emily.
are more. I'm going to start with another technical question from John to ask Jerry, are you shooting stills or taking frame shots from the videos that you're grabbing?
We're shooting high resolution stills. The only time we do video is if there's some sort of interesting behavior going on that we can't collect useful photogrammetry images, then we'll kind of switch to video, but for the most part, stills.
One of the questions was around what make up vessel strikes, whether they come from commercial or recreational vessels. I think it's kind of a hard one to answer.
And I think it ties into some of the other questions about general awareness of humpbacks to vessels. I don't think, sorry, Emily, do you want to address it at all, or Christy? It might be something that comes out in the analysis further down the line.
Yeah, I can imagine that's likely the case. And Christy, you might have a better answer to this, but I don't think from these scars we can tell what vessel has caused them.
There are sometimes, I mean, with, smaller propellers from smaller recreational vessels versus, larger propeller scars from bigger ships, that we can sometimes tell the difference between those, or we'll often see almost like you can see sort of how a smaller propeller has hit along the whale. Excuse me. And so sometimes the distance apart from the scars or the size of the scars can help us know that. But in saying this, if it's okay, I'll also answer a question about vessel strikes from Steve that was saying the vessel strikes are apparently all propeller strikes, yes or no? What if everybody operating in a whale area had a cage around the prop to prevent a strike? And that's something I think, thank you so much for bringing that up. Rather than showing that the only problem that vessels can cause is these propeller scars, I think it's really important to be clear that these scar studies are really minimal estimates of how often these threats are happening. So in the case of vessel strikes, there are whales that have stranded and died that have evidence of blunt force trauma from being hit by a large vessel or ship, but not visible propeller scars on the outside. So with some of these larger ships, larger vessels, they don't always create that visible scarring that you can see at the surface. Similar for the entanglement scarring. Of course, scars can heal over time, but also this only shows the whales that have survived their entanglement. So it really helps us get an idea of the scope of the threats and how widespread they are. But again, they're not going to capture how often these threats are actually happening. There's still going to be that minimum estimate, if that makes sense.
I think a really kind of good bridge question from Kevin came through about whether and who the organization or agency would be to track all documented vessel strikes, both with living whales and stranded or presumably dead whales.
I'm gonna lob that one to Christy.
Sure. So in terms of known vessel strikes and known entanglements, so these are ones that are seen that are actually documented, which imagine also that a large ship could hit a whale and not even necessarily know it or not report it. But for all the known ones, it is DFO that collects those incidents. So all over MERS' education, you'll see that 1-800 number. And that's where all vessel strikes and entanglements actually now legally have to be reported. It's under the marine mammal regulations that if your boat is in contact with a whale or your fishing gear is in contact with a whale, it is actually a legal requirement to report it to DFO. And DFO does track those. Because information can take time to become available, etc. MERS does also track incidents that we are aware of so that we can help track long-term survival of whales after a vessel strike or entanglement. And Jackie, I don't know if you want to add anything more to that.
No, I won't. We as MERS track everything that we can as well, very much from an education perspective. In knowing who the dead whales are and telling their stories as ambassadors for people to understand the extent of the threats. Yeah, leave it there. I know we've got more questions, Marika.
We Yeah, so I think we can also ask Gary to jump in on this one about the question from Craig was, is there any indication that the whales can detect the drone's presence?
Well, that'll kind of depends on altitude, but at the altitude we're operating at, it doesn't seem that the humpbacks anyway show any behavioral response to the drone whatsoever. Every once in a while with big killer whales or even northern residents, they'll sometimes roll on their side and look up, and whether that's just, you know, their behavior or they're looking up at the drone, I don't know. But yeah, nothing indicative from humpbacks anyway.
And it is part of the research license, and certainly initially when this photogrammetry work was being done, that any sort of responses need to be recorded. And it was looked at what, I believe it was looked at initially at what sort of level was there or wasn't there response, and that you're flying at 100 feet.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I would like to throw this one probably to Christy as well, in terms of the number of different organizations involved and whether everyone shares databases and what kind of data gets shared.
Actually, Jackie, do you want to take that
You
one
wanna do that
first?
one, Jackie?
Different organizations involved sharing data sets. Actually, well, I can start in terms of what data we're talking about. So for example, Tasli mentioned some research that we did looking at migration patterns of humpback whales in the North Pacific. And as you can imagine, that involved pulling together data not only from the coast of BC, where we have the CPHC, this great collaboration that Jackie's talked about, but we also needed data from all of these different collaborators in the breeding areas. And it was a daunting task, but actually fantastic to be able to collaborate with all these folks to know which of the humpback whales that we are seeing off the coast of BC migrate to Hawaii or Mexico or Central America, and start to inform those patterns so we can better manage humpback whales up here. So that's sort of one example of how these databases are being shared. Jackie already mentioned the CPHC here, which is this effort to bring together the humpback catalogs and the databases maintained by these different organizations along the coast so that we can collaborate. Yeah, Jackie, do you want to add any more there?
No,
Okay.
that works. Thank you.
I will just jump in quickly to that last question. Karina Draycott had mentioned that there, according to literature, there's been no detection of response above 20 meters of altitude for flying.
Okay, there are a whole bunch of really related questions around humpbacks and vessels and all that sort of thing. Before we jump into that though, Christy, just before we leave the kind of information sharing sector, do you mind answering a question from Catherine that came in around sharing data on the East Coast between coasts and Canada?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, good question. So we mentioned some of the sharing of data in the North Pacific, but also actually some of the work that MERS has been doing directly has really benefited from work that's been done on the East Coast. So one example of that is the aerial scar study that we're doing, and the boat-based scar study as well, looking that Emily cited, showing that about 47% of humpback whales here had scarring from entanglements. And those methods came from, I actually worked for a couple of years as a research assistant for some humpback researchers out on the East Coast, actually off the coast of Cape Cod. And they were the ones who sort of had been studying this in humpback whales. There were other folks in that area who had been studying scarring on right whales. And so I learned a lot from being able to assess the threats to those whales in the North Atlantic, and then be able to bring that over here to the North Pacific to understand that better too. That same nonprofit organization, the Central for Coastal Studies, has done a lot of the work in disentanglement as well. So looking at tools and methods to safely rescue whales from fishing gear. And another example that I'll just mention quickly as well, in terms of learning from the research of folks in the North Atlantic, is so we haven't talked about it all tonight, but MERS was the first to document a new humpback whale feeding behavior called trap feeding in 2011. And we did some work to look at how that behavior spread through humpback whales in northern Vancouver Island, and what sort of basically the idea of cultural transmission, so whales learning from each other and passing the behavior along between one another. And again, it was really interesting to be able to compare to something that they'd seen about a decade earlier on the East Coast, which was a different type of new feeding behavior, but that also was learned by different humpback whales there. So it was a really cool way to be able to say, I mean, it wasn't all exactly the same. In their case, it was likely because of a different prey. In our case, that doesn't seem to be the case, but it was really interesting to be able to sort of compare and contrast those behaviors and the reasons behind them.
I would really love to ask a question that came in for Joanne about whether and why the skin samples are used rather than blubber to check isotopes.
Yes, I saw that question.
Oh, good.
Yes, I was waiting to answer it sometime. Yes, so there's two reasons. Blubber has been measured in baleen, so that they're sort of teeth, in blubber, in muscle, and in skin. And it seemed that the skin is the best tissue that reflects diet, really. And also blubber is it's very fatty, it's very metabolically active, and it has a higher turnover rate, if you want. And also fats are isotopically depleted in carbon. So it is hard to measure a stable isotope of carbon in that tissue particularly.
Great, thank you. So this one is a question from Julia around when a whale is known to be entangled, is it known if they make any different sounds on hydrophones in terms of monitoring?
Yeah, so this might be a handoff between Christy and I. So having an underwater microphone, a hydrophone, and there are networks up and down our coast of hydrophones. When a whale is entangled, there's no vocalization, to my knowledge, associated with, because I'm presuming this question is being asked that other than just having visual detection of an entangled whale on our vast coast, but also way out there in the open ocean, could possibly acoustic clues be used? And the short answer is extraordinarily unlikely. So there is no knowledge that I know of relating specific vocalizations to an entanglement. It is that when entangled and also during the disentanglement, because unless a whale is in incredibly poor condition already, this is not an easy thing to be done by professionals, is that it is possible that you would hear more trumpeting. And that's a very powerful exhalation from the whale, but it is also done in all kinds of other contexts. So again, the short answer is having an acoustic way to detect if a humpback is entangled or not, no. Christy, I don't know if there's any further insights there.
Yeah, no, agreed with everything you said in terms of being able to detect an entanglement based on their vocals. I have seen entangled whales, heard entangled whales, and just anecdotally a couple of times make vocalizations that I had not ever heard humpbacks make before. But there, I think a lot more research would be needed to understand whether there's a chance of being able to detect entanglements based on those. I think it's a pretty rare occurrence that we hear vocals like that.
And John Ford with an E is weighing in as well, that indeed, yeah, emphasizing again, like the trumpeting is something that we associate with whales being exasperated, and that in his experience as well, that there is a lot of trumpeting that goes on during disentanglements, which is a testament to this is not a passive whale that knows you're going to disentangle it, but the trumpeting happens in an awful lot of other contexts as well.
Kind of a related question and that came from some people. So Karen was asking about how aware humpbacks are of traveling vessels compared to the awareness of killer whales. And then Michaela was asking about whether or not there is evidence that humpbacks have a lack of echolocation and whether that makes them more prone to vessel strikes other than marine mammals who do echolocate. So because they're linked, I'm going to ask those together.
Yeah, so there's thank you. And I suspect that some of these people have been to some of our presentations and might even be prompting us. Tell us why humpbacks may be getting entangled and hit more often by boats than toothed cetaceans. So humpback whales and other baleen whales are not known to have echolocation in the way of toothed whales. They've got 2 blowholes exposed. They don't have the echolocation organ over the second blowhole. So this unfortunate set of circumstances, you have big hungry whales, not just humpbacks, but other baleen whales as well, that are feeding here. They come back thin, they are hungry, they don't have echolocation in the same way. And I know there's other questions asking, yeah, but sometimes they interact with boats. We'll get to that. But generally, humpbacks, when they're hungry, when they are feeding, you are getting this from anyone who is around humpbacks. Please put on your video and see us nod. How oblivious are humpbacks of vessels when they are feeding? They are astoundingly oblivious. In fact, that's how I start presentations to boaters, by asking just very candidly who has almost hit a humpback. So they can be astoundingly oblivious of boats. Again, they're hungry. They don't have echolocation in the same way. They're much bigger. So both not only with vessel strike, collision, but also with entanglement, there is a much greater risk than there is for the toothed, or certainly for orca. Christy, I don't know if there's anything there that you want to add. Okay.
No, I assume there was a question about approaching boats, and we're going to get to that. So yeah.
If I can just add briefly, I think it's just a note, not specifically on strikes, but also just the effect of noise from vessels, and how echolocation and non-echolocating whales, it's still, vessel noise will still definitely, from what we know, affects them just very differently. And this is, Jackie can add more to this and Christy can add more to this, but yeah, I just wanted to add that it also plays into a difference of masking how these animals communicate. And we know less about how humpbacks are communicating and what calls they use, and than echolocating. But yeah, just the effect of vessel noise as well, of increased vessel traffic. And we didn't touch on that too much tonight, but yeah, just as well as vessel strikes, that's the other kind of impact of increasing vessel traffic.
No, and thank you so much, Ellie. And there is a question coming up around potential slowdown zones that'll pick up on that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that you've kind of covered a question that was asked by Steve around humpbacks and their awareness of vessels. So definitely those conversations on echolocation versus not impacts awareness.
Yeah, and I will add something. Like I think it's important to realize that the fact that toothed whales have echolocation, and therefore as a byproduct of that are better able to detect fishing gear, rocks, different kinds of fish, boats, is not because they've evolved for the detection of boats. It's a byproduct of how they've evolved to do the other things in their lives, like finding food, which isn't the same for baleen whales. So the toothed whales are gaining from that evolution in how they find their food, that they have echolocation. And none of the whales have had the time to evolve to the presence of we humans in our vessels. Should I answer the one about boat interactions, Marika?
Yeah, that's actually where I was going next. You're anticipating.
Yeah, so the question was around the attacking of humpbacks of boats, and I very much understand what's being asked, but they're not attacking boats. So most often, the humpbacks are, and certainly if they're feeding, they are so often oblivious of vessels. Yeah, hence the great concerns about collision. But these are highly social, highly intelligent animals. And if they're socializing, yeah, if they're not feeding, they'll play in kelp forests. They'll play with sticks. And they could be interested in some floaty thing, yeah, that's in the water and that they interact with the boats. There are certain areas on our coast where this happens more often. And it's part of our work too, that we're trying to track together with collaborators which whales undertake these behaviors, Again, they're referenced colloquially as mugging, but it is then a whale, a humpback, approaching and interacting around a vessel. We're trying to track who it is. Do they grow out of it? It is a certain age class, all that kind of question. But we suspect that, and Christy may add to this, and actually Joanne's work, it might potentially provide some clues around this as well. We think that, again, we know that if a whale is feeding, it's about food. If they are socializing, they may interact with their environment more. And this could be related to diet. So if you're feeding on herring, for example, as they do off northeastern Vancouver Island, you're going to be reliant on birds being around, ideally, not that they don't feed at depth, the humpbacks, but the birds can ball up the fish. So you're really feeding hard during the day when the birds are around. But if you're feeding on krill, krill goes down during the day unless it's thrown upward. So then you may get it flipped, that you're going to have most of the feeding happening at night and most of the socializing and interacting with their environment happening during the day. So this kind of behavior that gets referenced as mugging is definitely a concern. And it is also something that if somebody were to want to use their powers for evil, if you knew which whales are known to undertake this behavior, you could go sit at the legal distance, get a read on the whale's behavior, and have that then happen. So we're very thankfully, the whale watching community is using their expertise and understanding and not promoting generally these kinds of interactions, because it doesn't serve the whales in any way whatsoever to show these kinds of interactions. And also, it's not something that you can, it makes it more difficult from a business standpoint as well. You don't need to show these kinds of interactions, and it creates false expectations, and it certainly doesn't help in understanding the behavior of the whales.
Yeah, so in terms of questions that made me smile, there was a question from Maggie asking, could you imagine a time when there's a speed limit for boats traveling through high density stretches of ocean? I think this is a good one where Ali might be able to jump in as well. And it
so
hopefully
I'll start with the answer. So certainly, so the return of humpbacks has been so quick on our coast that there hasn't been a chance to catch up in many ways. So the incredibly important work, for example, that Ali is doing, that other work is showing the overlap, also the scarring study, and everybody who's helping deliver puzzle pieces about where the whales are, this is all helping now. Like, okay, we know they're getting hit. We know they're getting entangled. What can we do to reduce the overlap and to stop the problem at the source? So this is certainly a direction that we're moving in, and is also there in our messaging. Even having likened things like when Tasli had the big media release go out for the humpbacks of the Salish Sea and how many were seen this year, and emphasizing that there are calves who stay with their mums for a year to learn to feed here as well, that this is the equivalent of a school zone. Yeah, and do you want big trucks? Yeah, and there is so much that can be done here, because so far nothing is being done in terms of consideration of where the humpbacks are and where the large vessel traffic is. And then, as Ali has emphasized as well, it's not just about the risk of collision and the value of reducing the overlap and reducing the speed. Yeah, so that reduces the chance of how bad the impact is, quite literally. Usually when vessels go slower, there's also less noise as well. And Ali, I'll be quiet now.
No, that was great. Yeah, I was going to say something that's tricky with this work and with humpbacks is that they travel a lot and they cross a lot of jurisdictional regions with different governments, and obviously they do not care if there's a different government, but regulations change quite a lot over their distribution, and there's not a lot of consistency throughout the world for humpbacks and other whale species. But there are a lot of different examples of regulations used. And the only ones I know of for speed are voluntary. So they're voluntary slowdown zones, which have been shown for people to be responsive in some areas. And I think not to like a huge extent, but from what I've seen, this is kind of the preliminary step, is to have these like voluntary slowdown zones. I'm not saying that that's the best step forward, but yeah, that's what I've seen from other cases around the world. And it looks like Christy has something to add, and I can
Sorry.
say
I was just gonna jump in just to hopefully to not cause confusion. So we don't have any mandatory slowdowns that are in Canada that are aimed for protecting humpback whales, but we do have slowdown zones, Swiftsure Bank areas that are aimed at protecting killer whales, specifically southern resident killer whales. And those slowdown areas, and again, these are legally required just as of last year, and we're waiting to see what measures will be in place for southern resident killer whales off southwestern Vancouver Island this year. But one thing Tasli showed in her presentation, that overlap of humpback whale sightings and vessel traffic in that approach, basically through one, if you could straight in the southern Salish Sea. And so there is the opportunity that slowdown zones that are in place for killer whales might benefit humpback whales as well, though they tend to be associated with not only specific areas, but also specific times of year. So they're potentially incomplete in being able to protect humpback whales, but just making it clear that we do in Canada there's a voluntary slowdown for large shipping traffic, but there is also a mandatory slowdown zone by Swiftsure Bank off southwestern Vancouver Island, or there was last summer anyways.
I'm going to ask Christy to put her other hat on, if you could, you know where this is going and the work that you're doing and the initial results.
Yeah, so in my spare time, I also lead a research project with Fisheries and Oceans Canada's cetacean research program, looking at humpback whale density and distribution and behavior in the southern Salish Sea, so in those same shipping lane areas, both through doing year-round surveys where we've started to be able to estimate the numbers of humpback whales that are in that area at different times of year, but also collecting data to be able to basically predict spatially. So Ali already mentioned humpback whales travel a lot, and it would be hard to, every time there was a humpback whale in an area, quickly try to respond to that. So instead, we're looking at predicting, okay, at this time of year, where are the areas that we're likely to have the highest density of humpback whales, and be able to put that data forward. We also have been putting some suction cup tags on humpbacks. So they just stick onto the whale's back for a few hours, and it lets us know what the whale's dive behavior looks like and how they're using the shipping lanes. So we're starting to get some preliminary results showing some times of day and night in some cases where the whales are spending a higher proportion of their time closer to the surface. So all of that will hopefully help sort of inform what else might be required if we were to try to reduce the risk of vessel strike to humpback whales specifically.
And sorry, Ali, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess in the, this is kind of why I mentioned that we are looking for my study if there's any differences depending on where we are. So that this is specifically in northeast Vancouver Island in the upper Georgia Strait. But yeah, if there's any kind of spatial variation, if we're in maybe a smaller channel versus a bigger channel, if there's a difference in how vessels are interacting, and this may provide information to DFO when thinking about these kind of decisions. And if, say, this is totally a hypothetical situation, but if there's a tighter channel and boats are moving fast and quick, and there's a lot of whale activity, this could be a potential thing that we could track and detect any patterns present in there, and then present that for any future management decisions. So that's kind of looking into that spatial variation and any patterns that arise in there.
Yeah, there was a specific question asked by Joseph around studies that show a difference in vessel strikes and behavior with cruise ships and whether there's a difference due to COVID and having cruise ships not coming through Discovery Passage. So for anybody who might not know, that's between Quadra and Campbell River.
Yeah,
Might be
and this
kinda
might be
early.
a teamwork answer as well.
Yeah.
So we can't regionally nor temporally, because the work is being done now to look at the SCAR study. And in terms of any sort of noise impacts during COVID, where sure with cruise ships, there was less traffic. This isn't related to the risk of vessel strike. Again, because how would you know? Because so often the dead whales they're either at the bottom of the ocean, or they've drifted somewhere where they're too decayed, or it's too isolated to ever be detected. There was a study done by our Southeast Alaskan colleagues where they had the data to look at, did the humpbacks communicate at all differently? And they did detect that there was a bit of a difference, and we could relay that paper to you. Okay, we have 15 more minutes. Thank you for everybody who is hanging on, and we want to be sure that we do try to answer all the questions.
Yeah, I'm hoping to ask a bunch of prey questions kind of as much as I can together. So starting with a question specifically about with humpbacks returning, and is there noted competition between humpbacks and other species for prey?
Okay, yeah, this one, Christy and I were chatting about this question, who's going to answer it? So as is often our dynamic, I will answer as the educator, and Christy will enhance potentially as the researcher. So that there are more humpbacks that have come back from the brink, thank goodness, at post-whaling. This is a big difference. And what does that mean for the amount of krill and herring for other species? So there isn't the research to say anything concretely. What we can tell you as observations, and specifically for Northeastern Vancouver Island, part of MERS research with our colleague Jared Towers was looking at minke whales. And we have the same 6 minke whales generally around Northeastern Vancouver Island. And they used to be the only whales we would see lunge feed. They were the only baleen whale in the area. Now they've got a bunch of humpbacks that they are competing with. They're still coming, yeah, but there is occasionally that we see that if there is surface feeding on a herring ball, that you have a minke darting in there and a humpback whale. So yeah, for the minkies of the coast, there are now humpbacks feeding on the same prey. But I would also like to put forward that the beauty of more humpbacks is that they are fertilizing the very ecosystem in which they are taking food from. So they poo at the surface, as do all whales. They're fertilizing the plankton. And as a result, you have more food at the bottom of the food web. And not only are they just fertilizing here and creating more productivity, they're also doing that when they transport the nutrients when they migrate. Any enhancements, Christy?
Well, Joanne, feel free to jump in as well. I think one thing that we do need to be really aware of is we know when we refer to humpback whales eating a lot of herring, that's what we can see from the surface and off specifically Northeastern Vancouver Island in a relatively small area where MERS has been studying its behavior. But Joanne's work is largely focused on the fact that we don't know what humpback whales are eating in a lot of areas. We don't know what component these different species, or how much of their diet these different species make up. So like there's that really basic question before we could even really understand overall competition. I don't know, Joanne, do you have more to add there?
No, I think that's pretty much it. But yeah, I was going to say we have a lot of observational studies from the surface, but again, what happens that these whales spend so much time underwater that we don't know, and that's what we're trying, or I would like to answer as best as we can, and hopefully not necessarily just my project, but other projects look at differences between the different feeding regions before seeing if there's any competition particularly.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the seasonal changes and the regional changes, and it's all a lot more complicated than we know yet. And competition is hard to prove anyway, but I think it really highlights how important some of this work is tonight. So, yeah.
We may have a similar response in terms of we need to look at it more, but the question that was asked was, is there much known about changes of composition in humpback diet from year to year within the Salish Sea?
Yeah, so I think the same issue where Joanne's looking at the northern Strait of Georgia right now. We've got some samples being collected sort of collaboratively also in Fuca Strait and off northeastern Vancouver Island. But yeah, we're still in the phase of knowing what are they eating now, let alone how much it's changing. That being said, there was work way not specifically in the Strait of Georgia, but I mean, during whaling data, they did sometimes look at the stomach contents of humpback whales. And at the time, the stomach contents they looked at were very predominantly krill, whereas we know that humpback whales are eating a lot of fish, but again, that could have just been which humpback whales they were looking at and things like that. So yeah, lots more to still understand. Good thing we have Joanne.
And if I may add to this, with the collaboration that Chrissy is talking about, there should be another subset of samples coming from the Strait of Georgia in the planning season of 2023. So we're hoping to have at least a 2-year baseline to look at it more in detail. Come back next year and hopefully we'll have more to tell you.
Yeah, exactly. A question was asked around whether or not photos of humpback poop at the surface, if that'll help with diet studies. I'm not sure about photos, but also maybe sampling.
I don't know, Christy, you? Poop is great. Poop shows you all kinds of things. Drones are great in detecting poop, especially if the whale has been eating a lot of fish, because it's not bright red poop like krill poop. And then indeed, if you could collect said poop, it could tell you, like, but there's killer whale research being done like this, everything from pregnancy hormones to diet to stress hormones.
Yeah, and interesting too, because the poop question is going to be at a different time scale than the stable isotope question, right? Because what you eat and digest and poop out is going to happen at a different, a lot faster than, breaking down and then storing in your skin and blubber what the stable isotopes are. So it's an interesting question to add to it too, where looking at poop can give you a different set of information, more recent information. And Joanne's overall group, I believe, is doing some of that as well, right? Joanne, looking at what they're getting from humpback poop samples too?
Yes, we are so very excited about whale poop, whether it's killer whale or humpback whale. We have collected samples. As Jackie said, sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes it sinks quickly. Sometimes it's very nice, and we can recover it nicely. But yeah, the samples are being preserved, and future analysis definitely will help us with that as well. But we're all about the whale poop.
And back to the question about photos specifically. I mean, certainly if you see red poop, the likelihood is that whale was eating some species of krill. But again, how much of their diet that makes up, it's much easier to see krill poop than fish poop. But we will say, when Joanne was showing her initial results, Jackie and I were both very excited because as she and I and many others who have seen humpback whale behavior and poop in that northern Strait of Georgia were like, yeah, it's showing what we thought. They're eating lots of krill potentially. So yeah.
And as the educator, or not the only educator here, but I can imagine there are those who are now thinking, what does whale poop look like? Yeah, so it's not a large chunk, folks. One of the best quotes that we've ever had out of our dear colleague Christy McMillan is that it is a cloudy situation. So it is a pink cloud or silvery cloud or kind of in between cloud.
Okay, as much as we can keep going on this topic, and I know this, I want to make sure that we touch on a couple last questions, just being really cognizant of time. Question that has been answered in the chat was one on flick feeding. So I need to ask another question from Craig about change in times of the year when whales are coming and going to Hawaii, the Caribbean, to their breeding grounds, essentially.
Yeah, so Craig, thank you so much again. I think because it's another collaboration where I might be the better one initially to answer this. So is there a detected change in when humpback whales are migrating between the feeding grounds and the breeding grounds being known to be Hawaii, Mexico, Central America? So there is no, I suspect this might be tied to the idea that some people have that the humpbacks are overwintering here. So far, there is no evidence that that is happening at all. Our colleagues in Alaska have a few whales. Yeah, we believe it will always be the exception because there's a reason that they go to breed in warm water. And why there is year-round presence, though, of humpbacks in BC waters is because they don't all leave at the same time and they don't all return at the same time. Yeah, so there's staggered departures, there's staggered returns, and as a result, there's humpbacks off in BC waters the entire year. Whether that time is shifting at all, thankfully, because of this big overarching collaboration through Happy Whale, we might start getting a sense of that. But so far, there is nothing concrete that we can say, and Christy may tap into that. I don't know, Christy, if the SPLASH study might have this as a byproduct as well.
Yeah, I think it's a hard thing to answer because, you know, for example, I will now often say to people, well, you know, there's humpback whales in the Salish Sea in winter. And well, that didn't used to happen, did it? But also there didn't used to be humpback whales in the Salish Sea really at all for a long period of time. Tasli documented that that really rapid increase. And, you know, there were whale surveys in 2004 and 5 where they literally saw 0 humpbacks in the Strait of Georgia. So I think part of it is as humpback whales are returning to these areas, we're seeing that there are humpback whales here through that there's presence of humpback whales year round. Again, as Jackie mentioned, we don't know that the same humpback whales are necessarily staying year round, but that there is presence of humpbacks because at least of staggered migrations. But yeah, I think it's something that because humpback whales are still returning to a lot of these areas, and that's relatively recent, it's kind of hard to know that. One thing that in some of these breeding areas, though, that they've been looking at, so there have been some studies in Hawaii looking at, you know, what the timing of males arriving in the area versus females and how long they might stay in the area and things like that. So there does seem to be some benefits, for example, for males to spend more time in the breeding areas so that they can have a chance to breed with more females. But and then some years where Hawaii is seeing potentially fewer whales, potentially due to heat waves and things like that. But I think there's still, still it's going to depend on which humpback you're talking about in which area, and lots more questions still, I think.
Okay, folks, we're going to have one more question. Please hang on so that we can thank you at the end. One more question. Marika gets to decide what it is, and we'll be sure that we'll show you our email address so you can follow up with questions as well.
Oh, no pressure. I'm going to ask the final question that was asked from Heidi in terms of who we collaborate with. So whether or not there is collaboration with folks in manned lighthouses in terms of maybe relaying data or what they see. Also, I'm going to let you know now, folks, that I did forward a picture that came in from Joanne of humpback whale poop that was collected in the northern Strait of Georgia. If you're particularly bold or really have a sense of curiosity, you can go look at the picture that I've thrown in there.
It's a cloudy situation. Okay, thank you for being on that, Joanne. So lighthouse keepers, the people at the lights, have we connected with them? Marine Education and Research Society locally, yes. But the person who asked the question, hey, can you hook us up with the lighthouse keepers? Actually, now I think one of our beloved directors is also directly linked as well. But indeed, what we would hope that Fisheries and Oceans Canada would do as well is that this is a group that if we could do a presentation to talk about entanglement, to talk about whale behavior, humpback whale behavior generally, these are people with eyes on the water, where they not only might be able to detect aberrant behavior that could be related to injury, but they could also be used as a resource, very much so, for being on the lookout for entangled whales if they have been detected within the area. We were very lucky that we got a huge amount of data from the Scarlet Point lighthouse keeper, who was a photographer and was our absolute lead in data contribution just north of Port Hardy. And as recently as today, the local lighthouse keeper was essential in, not humpback related, but in seeing orca. But please, if there's a way that we can present to lighthouse keepers generally, we've not been able to do that in the time that we've been educating.
Not just from a collaborative point to this, I know Gary's left, maybe Karina's still in here. I think that some of our colleagues at Oceanwise, though, have likely done lots of reaching out to light keepers to report sightings of whales and sightings of entanglements and vessel strikes as well. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in, but that, yeah, just to say that even if MERS is sort of a bit more local in our collaborations with light keepers, there are others that have done that. And I actually once lived for a month at the Langara Light Station on the very northwest tip of Haida Gwaii, and that light keeper there certainly was very keen on reporting his sightings of whales, and has been for a long time.
Thank you so much, Christy, for making sure that it's not just about the MERS perspective on that. So thank you. Thank you so very much to all our collaborators, for all the presentations done. In addition to the contents that's been brought across tonight, what we also wanted to show is the all together now piece of this. That by sharing information through collaborations, we can be collectively of better use to the whales. But everybody who signed on for this, who watched this, who asked questions, you're part of that too. You're part of the whole all together now. The more that you know, the more that you can help be a voice for the whales. If you're a boater in modeling the right behavior, if you're on the water, any way of knowing how you can contribute the data to the collaboration. And the more that you know about whale behavior as well, the more you'll know when it is not regular whale behavior. And I don't know if any of my collaborators, colleagues wish to add anything, but really a very big depth of gratitude to you for making this the success that it was.
Yeah, thank you so much to all our research associates who presented, and all of you who joined us for their Saturday evening. This was really awesome, and your questions were fantastic. Thank you so much for all the participation.
And for our gang who presented, if you want to hang on briefly, that would be great. And good night, everybody. Thank you so much.